According to Hatch, narrative research, like other qualitative interview studies, can be framed within any of the paradigms, except the positivist. So, if we were to take a positivist research journey, it would be founded on an ontological belief that there is a single, knowable, and ultimately controllable reality. The researcher would be an objective observer, collecting quantitative data from the subjects, with the ultimate aim of uncovering or confirming some generalizable and transferable truths. In contrast to positivism, an interpretivist researcher assumes that reality is socially constructed. That is, there is no single observable reality. Instead, there are multiple realities or interpretations of a single event. Interpretivists do not find knowledge, they construct it. According to Levers, objective reality can never be captured. It can only be known through representations. And the emphasis should be on recognizing and narrating the meaning of human experiences and actions. Essentially, this is at the heart of narrative inquiry, with its focus on uncovering participants' experiences as they are presented through time, social relationships, stories, and texts. So here our narrative journey begins, along the borders of post-positivism, within the landscape of interpretivist ontologies. So this is where we find Edmund Husserl, who very much straddled the border between post-positivism and interpretivist ontologies. And it's widely believed that most qualitative research is founded on Husserl's phenomenology. Now, phenomenology involves examining the participant's first-person subjective reality, and it seeks to uncover how people interpret things, objects, and experiences through their senses. And as such, it has much in common with narrative inquiry that also attempts to explore reality through our lived experience. However, Husserl believed that in order to gain this understanding, the researcher must first put aside or bracket their own beliefs, preconceptions, and bias. As a researcher, you might draw on Husserl's theory of bracketing in order to avoid your own judgments clouding what your participants are actually saying, and to maintain a greater reflexivity in your work. Working along these borderlines can get tricky and may lead to inconsistencies between your ontological, epistemological, and methodological approaches, particularly as narrative research seeks to explore personal experiences without reducing them to generalizable theories, and advocates for the co-construction of narratives between researcher and participants. From an ontological perspective, Husserl also believed that language was separate from experience, and the role of the researcher was to analyse the language in order to get to the experience. This is different to narrative inquiry in that experience and language are interdependent. Martin Heidegger's philosophy aligns much more closely with a narrative inquiry approach. A former student of Husserl's, Heidegger continued to develop and question some of Husserl's earlier philosophies. Perhaps the greatest departure, both ontologically and epistemologically, was his assertion that you cannot simply separate yourself from your historical, cultural, and personal beliefs. And rather than putting your prejudices and assumptions aside, as Husserl had suggested, Heidegger believed you should instead bring yourself into question along with the matter. In Clandinin and Connolly's Guide to Narrative Inquiry, researchers are also advised to first analyse their own lived experiences before embarking upon narrative research. And this can also be done regularly throughout the process of data gathering and analysis to ensure greater reflexivity. Also, the emphasis on the commonplace of time in narrative methodologies also draws on Heidegger's influential book, Being and Time, in which he discusses the temporal and historical nature of being. Narrative analysis can also be traced back to Hans Georg Gadamer and hermeneutics. And hermeneutics itself can be traced even further back to studies of the Bible, Talmud, and Quran. Now, ontologically, both Heidegger and Gadamer contrasted with the Husserl in that they believed our involvement in research is always subjective, and that our prejudices, rather than muddying the waters, are what open us up to what can be understood. They believed that the phenomena being studied is not only described using language, it comes into being through language. So if you are conducting narrative research, hermeneutics forms part of this, and it is founded on the epistemological assumption that humans come to understand the world through language, both in dialogue and written text. The concept of the hermeneutic circle was first explored by Friedrich Schleiermacher in the early 19th century, and was then expanded on by Heidegger and Gadamer. It can be used in narrative research as a way of orientating and interpreting text and dialogue. Gadamer and Heidegger saw the method of interpreting text as more of a cyclical process that takes into account the linguistic, social, contextual, and temporal influences that colour how a story is told and how it is interpreted. Around this time, working within the fields of philosophy, literary criticism, and semiotics, was the Russian Mikhail Bakhtin. Now, we've talked about the commonplace of time in narrative inquiry, while the other two commonplaces of sociality and place can be traced back to Bakhtin's work. Indeed, he was a key figure in developing narrative analysis. He believed that all human action is dialogic in nature, and that we interact and understand our world through dialogue. This includes our own internal dialogue and our dialogue with others. Bakhtin highlighted that none of the things we say or do, whether we speak, listen, write, read, or think, occur within a vacuum. And the three main principles of his theory include the idea of utterance, what someone says, the addressee, who the utterance is directed towards, and the voice. When an utterance is made, it produces a voice. The consideration of interview place and its impact on how the storyteller and the listener jointly create the stories can also be traced back to Bakhtin. Paul Ricoeur is one of the most frequently mentioned philosophers in narrative research. He was interested in the notion of temporality and narrative, and essentially drew together these various schools of philosophy into what can be defined as hermeneutic phenomenology. In Van Manen's words, phenomenology describes how one orients to lived experience. Hermeneutics describes how one interprets the texts of life. In his influential book, Time and Narrative, Ricoeur explored how humans use narratives as a way of making sense of time. Moen describes how Ricoeur's theory can help us to understand the narrative research process. Firstly, in the dialogue that happens between the researcher and the participant, one or more stories are written down and become fixed in a text. This means that the narrative in question is no longer tied to the moment in which it occurred. Second, by fixing the narrative in a text, it becomes detached from the moment it occurred and has assumed consequences of its own. Third, the narrative can, in this way, assume importance that goes beyond the initial situation and becomes relevant in other contexts. In his book Narrative and Time, Ricoeur also talks about narrative identity. What story does a person tell about his or her life, or what story do others tell about it? During this time, Clifford Geertz was working under the methodological umbrella of ethnography. Geertz moved away from research that sought to produce generalizable findings about a specific phenomena or culture to focus on the fine detail of human experience, using what is now commonly known as thick descriptions. Geertz argued that local knowledge was the foundation for understanding human culture and personal interaction. Within narrative research, rich, thick descriptions enable the researcher to describe in detail the participants and the settings of the study. Although the American psychologist Jerome Bruner is probably better known in education for the term scaffolding, he also published widely on the topic of culture and narrative, and he is considered one of the key theorists in the development of narrative inquiry. Bruner was critical of the way in which psychology and research tried to reduce experience, identity, and human cognition into coded data. In trying to get to the essence of understanding, Bruner drew together schools of literature, humanities, and anthropology, and was particularly interested in Geertz's theory of culture and the situated nature of meaning. Like Geertz, Bruner understood narratives to be social constructions that were coloured by larger cultural narratives and life histories. Bruner's work was also informed by hermeneutics. However, he believed it was not the structure of the text that was key to understanding. Moreover, the universal nature of narratives provided a window into the self. One of Bruner's main epistemological contributions was the theory that humans understand the world in two ways: the paradigmic, or logical scientific mode, and the narrative mode. Bruner contended that the storied knowledge was equally as relevant as the scientific, despite a long history of it being overlooked in Western culture. When conducting narrative research, it is also important to determine what constitutes a story. Bruner outlined 5 essential elements within a story, which can be used in the analysis, structuring, and presentation of narrative data. These are: number 1, an actor; number 2, an action; number 3, a goal; number 4, a scene; and number 5, instrumentality. He also believed a compelling story should contain a 6th element, that of trouble, and it is this tension that makes a story worth telling. Lev Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist who specialised in developmental psychology. Vygotsky was critical of any research that sought to separate participants from their social and cultural settings, and he believed that our identities, our understandings, and our very being were dependent on what we have experienced in the social context in which we have participated. For Vygotsky, humans generate understanding and meaning through social interactions within a particular culture and point in time. This can be viewed as a relational ontology. Put simply, the relationships between entities are ontologically more fundamental than the entities themselves. He did, however, contrast with Bruner's view of a narrative as a window into the mind of the participants. Instead, Vygotsky saw language and storytelling as a cultural tool. His theories are therefore often used to frame narrative research, in particular as it relates to the co-construction of understanding and research findings between the researcher and the participants. John Dewey was one of the early founders of American pragmatism and one of the most influential scholars of the first half of the 20th century. Notably, Connolly and Clendenin's narrative inquiry methodology and their 3 dimensions of temporality, place, and sociality are built on Dewey's understanding that experience involves social interactions enacted in situations, environments, and cultures over time. Reality, according to Dewey, is based on everyday real-world experiences, and we learn by reflecting on these experiences. Like Vygotsky, Dewey believed human beings were fundamentally attached to what surrounds them. In Dewey's ontology, human beings are not subjects or isolated individuals. Instead, they're forever tied to their environment, organically related to it, changing it even as it changes them. Your own personal interpretation of an event or phenomena can change and take on a different meaning at different moments in time. However, Dewey differed in that he saw experience as helping to form thinking, whereas Vygotsky believed culture was the raw material of thinking. So when considering why you're conducting narrative research, it is also useful to look at Dewey's pragmatism, for he repeatedly rejected any view of philosophy that had its goal in understanding without change. Richard Rorty can be defined as a neo-pragmatist. While he believed philosophy should start with language, he rejected the idea of the narrative term because it is simply another attempt at representationalism. His views also lean towards postmodernism, in that he believed we can never be absolutely sure that what we think is true, and we can never really prove that human knowledge accurately portrays external reality. The work of Bakhtin can also be seen to inform postmodernist theories, as it raises questions about who is speaking, who is not speaking, who is hearing, and how. In this paradigmic landscape, there is no static and everlasting truth. Instead, there are different subjective positions from which we experience and interpret the world. Hatch describes post-structuralism as an anti-paradigm, in that it is used to deconstruct or pull apart other paradigms and to question the grand narratives of the past. Researchers often draw upon the deconstructionist theories of Derrida and Foucault when applying analytic techniques to text-based and narrative data, particularly in relation to the social historical structures of power. A post-structuralist research study would ultimately question if it were even possible to capture the complexity of individual lives in text. Where you decide to start your narrative research journey really depends on your own ontological and epistemological beliefs, and, to some extent, your research question. You may draw upon Bakhtin's theory of utterance, addressee, and voice, or you may frame your collaborative research within Vygotsky's social constructivism. Whatever you choose, it is important to understand that by undertaking this narrative journey, We don't just describe human experience. The experiences themselves are changed as a result of this social, reflective and interpretive journey. And ultimately, so too are we, the researcher. It is this ontology that is really at the heart of narrative research.